This happened a few weeks ago. My brother-in-law Dave owns a hunting cabin out past a stretch of state forest in Wisconsin, a small one-room place his father built decades ago, mostly used a few weekends a year during deer season. My husband and I went up with Dave and his wife for what was supposed to be a relaxed early season weekend. Nothing to do with hunting, just getting away from the city for a couple of days. We noticed something was off almost immediately, though none of us said anything out loud at first. Little things. A window that Dave swore he'd left latched was cracked open when we arrived. A can of soup was missing from the pantry shelf, and none of us could account for it. The woodpile out back, which should have had enough split logs to last a long weekend, had less than half of what Dave remembered leaving in October. The first night passed without incident, and we mostly wrote off what we'd noticed as bad memory or an animal getting into the pantry through some gap we hadn't found. It was the second night that changed everything. Around 1 a.m., my husband woke me up, gripping my arm hard enough that I knew immediately something was wrong. He'd heard a sound coming from inside the wall behind our bed. Not scratching, not the settling sound old cabins make, but a slow, deliberate shifting, like weight moving carefully to avoid making noise, followed by what was unmistakably the sound of breathing. We woke Dave and his wife, and the four of us stood in the main room of the cabin at nearly 2 a.m. listening, and we all heard it at the same time. Movement inside the wall cavity that ran along the back of the cabin, between the bedroom wall and the exterior siding, a space Dave said was only supposed to be a few inches of insulation and framing, not anywhere near large enough for a person. Except it was large enough, we found out later, because that back section of the cabin had been built with a wider gap for old plumbing that had never actually been run. Something Dave's father had mentioned once years before, and none of us had thought about since. We didn't confront whatever was in there. Dave grabbed a rifle he kept locked in a cabinet, more for reassurance than anything. And the four of us got in the truck and drove the 20 minutes to the nearest gas station with a working payphone, since none of our cells had signal, and called the county sheriff. 2 deputies met us back at the cabin around 4 a.m., and what they found after prying open an access panel behind the wood stove that none of us had known existed was a man, mid-30s, living in a space between the walls that had clearly been outfitted for exactly that purpose, with a sleeping pad, several days of stolen food, and a small hole drilled through the drywall at eye level, positioned to look directly into the bedroom where my husband and I had been sleeping the first night. The deputies told Dave, once the man had been taken into custody, that this wasn't the first case they'd handled like it that season. A small number of seasonal hunting cabins in that same stretch of forest had reported missing food and unexplained sounds over the past year. And in at least one earlier case, at a different property, the homeowner had never found an explanation before eventually selling the cabin out of unease. The man was charged with trespassing and stalking, though the deputies admitted quietly that they weren't sure how long he'd actually been living inside that wall before we arrived, or how many previous groups of hunters had slept a few feet away from him without ever knowing it. Dave sealed off that section of the cabin permanently within the week. None of us have gone back since. This happened decades ago, back when my father was in his 20s, and he told it to me the same way every time I asked, which is part of why I believe every word of it. He and 2 college friends had rented an isolated cabin in the Adirondacks for a week during winter break. The cabin sat at the end of a mile-long unplowed driveway, reachable only by the truck with the nearest neighbor more than 2 miles off, and no phone line run out that far in those days. 3 days into the trip, a heavy snowstorm rolled in, the kind that dropped over a foot overnight and made the driveway impassable even for the truck. They didn't think much of it. They'd stocked up on supplies expecting exactly this and settled in to wait it out. Around midnight on the fourth night, with the storm still going outside, someone knocked on the cabin door. My father said his first thought, and the thought of both his friends, was that something had happened to a neighbor and they needed help, so he opened the door without much hesitation. Standing there was a man, maybe 50, dressed for the weather but not dressed like someone who'd been walking far. No snow packed onto his boots, no ice on his coat despite the storm still coming down hard around him. He said his truck had slid off the road about a mile back and asked to use their phone. They told him they didn't have one, which was true, and my father said the man's expression changed at that answer. Not disappointment, but something closer to recalculation, like he'd been expecting a different response and was now working out a new plan. He asked if he could wait out the storm inside anyway, and my father, uneasy but not sure why, said they only had room for the 3 of them and offered instead to let him warm up by the door for a few minutes before continuing on, which the man accepted without complaint. He left after about 10 minutes, walking back out into the storm in the opposite direction from where he'd said his truck was stuck. They didn't think much more of it that night. But the same knock came again the following night, same time, almost to the minute, and this time it was 2 men, not one of whom my father recognized as the man from the night before. They gave a different story this time, said they were hunters who'd gotten turned around in the storm. No mention of a truck at all, and again asked to come in and again accepted the offer to warm up by the door rather than pushing the issue when told there wasn't room. It was the third night when the knock came again, and my father's friend Carl looked through the window before answering, that they understood something was very wrong. There were now 4 men outside, spread out at the edge of the tree line behind the 2 standing at the door, not approaching, just watching the cabin. They didn't open the door that night. They doused the lights, moved into the single bedroom, and took turns staying awake with the only weapon they had, which was a hatchet meant for splitting kindling. The knocking continued for almost 20 minutes before stopping, and my father said the silence that followed was worse than the knocking had been, because they had no way of knowing whether the men outside had actually left. The storm broke the next morning, and as soon as the driveway was passable, they packed the truck in under 15 minutes and drove straight to the nearest town, where they reported the whole thing to the local police. Nothing ever came of the report, as far as my father knew. He never went back to that cabin, and he told this story to me exactly the same way every single time. This story is 8 months old. I took a seasonal caretaking job at a private cabin property in rural Montana, the kind of gig where you live on-site through the off-season, checking on the buildings, handling minor maintenance, and making sure nothing froze or fell apart while the owners were away for the winter. It paid well for what seemed like easy work, and the property itself was beautiful. A main cabin plus 2 smaller guest cabins, all sitting on 80 acres, a solid 20-minute drive from the nearest paved road. About 2 weeks into the job, going through a drawer in the main cabin's office, looking for a spare key, I found a spiral notebook that had belonged to the caretaker before me, filled with day-to-day notes about the property. Most of it was mundane, weather, maintenance tasks, deliveries. But the entries from the last 3 weeks before it stopped were different. The earlier caretaker, whose name I later learned was Ray, had started writing about a man showing up at the edge of the property in the evenings, always around dusk, always standing at the tree line near the guest cabins without approaching the main house. Ray's notes described trying to talk to him twice, both times getting no response, just the man staring back until Ray gave up and went inside. The entries got shorter and more anxious as they went on, and the last one, dated abruptly with no entry after it, simply read, "He was inside guest cabin 2 tonight. Door was locked. I checked it myself this morning." There was no further explanation in the notebook, and no indication of what had happened to Ray, only that his employment had clearly ended around that date, since the property owners had needed to hire someone new. Me, shortly after. I didn't sleep well that first night after finding it, and over the following week I started noticing small things that made those entries feel less like an old caretaker's paranoia and more like a pattern repeating itself. A gate at the edge of the property that I was certain I'd latched was open one morning. Guest cabin 2, which I kept locked exactly as instructed, had a door I found unlatched on 2 separate mornings, despite no sign of forced entry, meaning whoever was getting in either had a key or knew how to bypass the lock without damaging it. The night everything came to a head, I was doing my evening walk of the property around 8 p.m. when I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the tree line near guest cabin 2, exactly where Ray's notes had described, watching the cabin without moving. I didn't approach. I went straight back to the main house, locked every door, and called the property owner, who told me to call the county sheriff immediately, which I did. A deputy arrived about 40 minutes later, the response time out there being what it was, and did a sweep of the property, but found no one, though he did find fresh boot prints near guest cabin 2 that didn't match my own boots or any of the property's regular equipment. He told me, gently but directly, that they'd had a report the previous year from the same property, filed by a Ray Whitfield, describing almost exactly what I'd just described, and that the case had gone nowhere because no suspect was ever identified and no crime beyond trespassing could technically be proven. I called the property owner again that night, this time telling them I couldn't stay through the rest of the contract, and they didn't argue with me, which told me they understood more about what had happened to Ray than they'd let on when they hired me. I left 3 days later, and to this day I don't know who that man was, what he wanted, or what actually happened during whatever incident made Ray's notebook stop mid-entry, with no explanation at all. I think about that unfinished line more than almost anything else from that winter. He was inside guest cabin 2 tonight, and the fact that Ray never got the chance to write down what happened after.